Good evening to all. This is Abhivardhan from GLA for Global Hint. Here we have another interesting episode for Global Hint, and I think the rest of the panelists will be joining shortly. So we have for now Saurabh, Samir, and Surya. Tonight we are going to discuss about a very tumultuous week that the MEA of the Government of India had. Some very important summits, some very interesting developments on the India's global approach in terms of diplomacy and economics, and also about the word of the word, which is the Indo-Pacific. So uh, this will be a very specific talk in the sense that to understand the significance of these summits and the kind of developments which have come in. I would also like the viewers to go to, I think, News 18, where Surya had recently published a very interesting article on how the Quad has somehow agreed that, the Indo-Russian ties have some significance to boost the Quad. And I would like to state that after reading that article, I related it with my own funny theory that if Trump would have stayed and would have thought in a saner way, then maybe he could have thought for US-Russia approachment or furthering the Indo-Pacific agenda. But again, that's a funny assumption, but I'm not getting into it. So let's begin with the discussion, and I'll first give the floor to Saurabh to give a simple brief in 2 to 3 minutes about what has happened in this week so that the viewers get an insight, and then we'll directly go ahead with the questions. I think the rest of the panelists will be joining in a while. And if the viewers would like to ask questions, please feel free to do so. So, Saurabh, over to you.
Thank you, Abhivardhan. So, I mean, the three big things are, like the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis, conflict, war, choose how you want to say. Then the India-Japan summit, and then the recent visit by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. So, I mean, the things are unfolding regarding Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine seems to be holding. Uh, Russia seems to be increasing its offensive, and I think given the like cloud of information slash misinformation, like not really sure, like what is happening. I think unless you're too deeply involved in that area, but it seems that like Russia is increasing its control of at least the port city of Mariupol, I think. So that's happening. In terms of the very interesting visit by the Japanese PM, uh, I think the agreements signed were like quite important, especially the like billions of dollars of investment that Japan has agreed in India, I think through its companies and through loans. So that's important. And then the most I would say interesting aspect is Wang Yi's visit yesterday and how he was or wasn't received like in India, and how were the discussions with EM Jaishankar, and especially the fact that the MEA felt it was prudent to do a press conference or at least a press briefing right after Wang Yi left. That's unique because I think we haven't seen that happen that frequently. It's usually the spokespersons who do the briefing. So it was very significant that maybe India was trying to set the tone of what was being discussed before China would have the opportunity to set the narrative. So yeah, that's kind of I think the brief overview.
Great. So let's come on the Quad first, and then we'll discuss about other developments related to Russia, Ukraine, and others, and how has India created its own share of leverage. So my question is to Akshob. Hi, Akshob, welcome. And the question which I have is, we have seen that the Australian ambassador in India, I think, if I'm correct, has recently said that the Quad understands India's position on Ukraine-Russia crisis, and somehow it's a very good indication in terms of how the Quad members look at India's role in this grouping. So, how do you see this development per se, as far as we know, and you also know how in the whole region, whether it's America and Europe, how have the commentators described on India's position? And so, in that regard, how do you see this? Yeah.
So fundamentally, look, nothing changes as far as the India-US relationship goes in this aspect. It's important to bifurcate what said on Capitol Hill and was what the administration is saying, right? I mean, Capitol Hill is yes, there are lawmakers there, and there are people who are part of various committee, including Foreign Affairs Committee, and they do have gravitas, but that doesn't directly translate to what the administration is saying. Right? The administration hasn't said anything to the extent of anything that would be termed as excoriation or condemnation of that sort. And fundamentally, because that's very well codified how India approaches its foreign policy, and that's known. So I think you have to understand that in two ways, right? Congressmen will speak for the because they have constituency to appease to, they have their own policy, they have their own view minds, or because the nature of the Russia-Ukraine escalation has been unprecedented in some ways, right? I mean, it's 2022, and in some ways, this looks like 1939 with some sort of invasion here. So, whether without getting into that minutia, so there is a level of unprecedentedness towards it that has brought out statements, right? Now, that's the first part. The second part is if you just look at again comments that come from either the White House spokesperson Jen Psaki, the State Department spokesperson Ned Price, it's fundamentally been we understand India's position. It's made different from ours, and that's if you go back to I mean in the bilateral history, that's always been different. Even when India and US signed the civil nuclear deal around 2005 2006, President Bush was being fiddled by President Musharraf in Pakistan. So India always understood that with a bifurcation of interests as well. And you may sign the civil nuclear deal with India, and then 3 years later, Pakistan gets the biggest aid package from the United States. So it's never, nothing is based on mutual exclusivity. So I think the United States understands that. I mean, look, Biden's comment again it may have been glib, may have been flippant, but I wouldn't read too much into that somewhat shaky comment. It's off the cuff, maybe not off the cuff, but it's not. It doesn't translate to policy. That's the important thing. Fundamentally, from the Japanese perspective or the Australian perspective, the other two Quad members, they've understood that perspective as well. And don't forget, the first time when the Quad took off or didn't take off, it's Australia was very more reticent about condemning China because Kevin Rudd was the prime minister then, and Kevin Rudd is a fluent Mandarin speaker, and Australia was very dependent on China for its commodities trade because while the world was collapsing in 2008, China's boom had begun, and China's manufacturing boom. So China's building up of cities was largely reliant on trade with Australia. Countries inherently approach it from their own perspective. The Quad is not a abandonment of any foreign policy; it's mutual synergy in one particular region, which is the Indo-Pacific. And while Russia, Ukraine, because the unprecedented nature of the scale is dominating discourse, but last we checked, the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov do not fall in the Indo-Pacific. So it technically should and shouldn't at the same time be discussed. And last but not least is the perspective of even with India and Russia, right? Even though we just had the first just 2+2 in December, it's not just people just look at it as very simply transaction. It's not just a military perspective, right? It's not just we get weapons from here, and there's talk of some congressmen saying that we get Lockheed and Boeing to substitute everything, and we get more oil from the United States and Russia. It's fundamentally it goes a lot beyond that, right? There's what we call hesitations of history. Indian foreign policy is also very cognizant of history in the sense, right? And it's not a sense of repayment of dues like a Lannister, but it's the fact that the USSR has been a very stable P5 vote for India in the past. That place today may be a little more France, but that's fundamentally been that case. There's also been a sense of joint science and technology thing. I mean, if you can even go into small cultural aspects. For example, India today owes a lot of its grandmaster chess success to the Russian cultural centers that were first set up in Chennai, right? I mean, small things like that, right, which people may not have remembered. Like there is the fact that from 49 to 70s until the Americans at Bobby Fischer, it was pretty much the Soviets dominating in chess, and a lot of so India is very cognizant of a lot of that in the past, and fundamentally, an abstention is not a vote for Russia. That's what India made very clear. An abstention is a choice. It's not pusillanimous. It is calculated, and it's based on the fact that it's diplomacy over diatribe that's chosen. And I think because what's happened, because of the nature of this conflict being unprecedented, there is this thing of trying to find clutch straws, if you will, on some of the arguments. So I'll just leave it there for now, and then we can come back to it.
Sure. Surya, I would like to add on this because I think, as I had referred your article, of course, how do you see this development? And I think you can emphasize on the economic sphere also because of the impact of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. We'll discuss some aspects of it, including how India is collaborating with the EU. But for now, how do you see the development. And of course, you can give a good follow up to Akshob's comments. Yeah.
Sure. I think it's quite important to look at uh, the actual tangible outcomes versus what you see in the media, and I think that they've been at odds with each other to some extent because, as you mentioned, the Australian High Commissioner to India had said that the Quad members are on board with what India's position is. They understand our position versus, the context of Russia and Ukraine. So I don't think that, the media reports and the speculation by think tanks, I think that you have to leave that aside for a second and look at really what this means on the ground for, especially in the Indian context, what it means for its economic strength in the middle of this conflict. You see specifically, and I'd like to talk about the natural resources side here. China going out there to perhaps expand its access to Russian energy, not just energy, but also dry bulk commodities and metals. So this can really support their economy in many ways and make it more competitive versus most manufacturers around the world. At the same time, you see the U.S. cutting tariffs on Chinese finished goods. 64%, if I believe, of Chinese goods which were attracting tariffs are no longer going to attract those Trump era tariffs. But those goods, in many ways, are produced using in some part Russian energy. So it's a the sanctions are, I think, a little. They're very. It's a sledgehammer style sort of sanctions, which the U.S. themselves are not really going to lose anything from because they're energy independent. A and B, they're cutting tariffs on Chinese goods, which are produced to some extent, using Russian energy. So, and Russia and China is not playing ball on American sanctions. So there's a degree of hypocrisy here, right? And I think that um, uh, to expect India to go out there and cut ties with Russia, for obviously that was not expected, but to kind of really decouple economically, I think that this doesn't make sense. In this context, when you look at the Quad and its longer term objectives, we have to remember that a stronger India is actually essential for maintaining security and stability in the Indo-Pacific. A militarily and economically weakened India, and when you look at an economically weakened India, there could be political weakness in India as well. So a lot of these things kind of go together. If this happens, the Quad really will suffer. The longer term problems that exist in the Indo-Pacific, challenges to the rules based order, that those will not be addressed. So we already know what it took for China to leapfrog other countries because they had an advantage in information about COVID. So they kind of knew things in advance, and they managed to still grow in a year when the rest of the world was falling behind. Now that little bit of acceleration has actually given them a significant edge in the Indo-Pacific compared to the pre-COVID era, right? So you can't let that happen with India now. If it falls behind and it does not grow this year, I mean, you're going to have years, 3 years, 4 years of economic distress in a country which should be eventually challenging China at some point, maybe in the long term, but at least in the short term, being able to stave off some of the threats that exist. So a weakened India, which kind of will be weakened if there's high inflation and very low industrial productivity competitiveness versus China, would really serve the U.S. also and Europe in the long term. A bad. It won't serve them well, right? I just don't see how that can happen. I think there's a very strong case for India to deepen its relationship with Russia. Another very interesting point. Um, it sounds counterintuitive, but the more oil that China and India buy from Russia, the lower the inflation in the West, because they don't have to pull the barrels from other countries. They don't have to compete with Europe for those barrels. So it is kind of counterintuitive, but in fact, buying Russian energy will actually help the West. So all in all, if you look at it, this is not a bad outcome. But here really the question is, how much pain can the West really take, politically, economically, and therefore politically, to kind of outmuscle Russia and kind of defang it. Right? I think that it's very there's a tipping point. The Germans actually came out and said very clearly that if we continue with this, if we don't import Russian oil and gas, we can really end up in poverty, and there could be mass social unrest. I mean, this applies to other countries as well, right? Which are dependent on Russian energy. So I'm not saying that India is dependent on them, but I'm saying that other countries that are will face similar problems. So there are limits of sanctions, clearly, and you're getting to an environment of a stalemate potentially at some point, I think. And there are longer term risks that exist even in Europe. The longer this crisis draws out, and if there happens to be an insurgency in Ukraine, an Afghanistan style insurgency, this will be very detrimental to Europe's longer term security. Not just security, but their economy as well. Um, you can't have, you already have the risk of weapons floating back into Western Europe, the ones that have gone in. Organized crime will increase, human trafficking will increase. These are problems which which nobody really is talking about, because they're kind of the secondary problems. We don't need to. We have to be concerned about the refugees who are moving in, of course, absolutely. But beyond that, I think that there are some real big challenges that Europe will have to face. On top of that, they're printing money to kind of attract to basically finance their gas purchases from other parts of the world. They're going to be buying gas from the U.S. The U.S. stands to benefit by nearly $500 billion almost from natural gas sales into Europe. You look at the stock price of any energy exporter from the U.S. It's gone through the roof. Why? Because Europe has to buy from them now. Look at defense companies. The stock price of all defense companies in the U.S. gone through the roof. Why? Because Europe has to buy from them now. This is America's great power play. They're going to come out relatively unscathed, at least in the short term, because they're actually going to come out stronger because they're going to suck Europe dry. And I'm using this term very, it's a harsh way to look at it, but that's exactly what they're doing. And they're doing it to consolidate their economic and military sphere of influence. They're not concerned whether rampant inflation destroys the parts of the European economy or makes sure that Europe kind of stays at a low, structurally lower level of economic prosperity. They're not interested in that. What they're interested in is consolidating power versus Russia and the East in general. In this context, India fits in where? It's kind of like a area of interest for the West. That's, I would say, probably that's about it, which they would like on their side. And but I think what India is doing anyway is kind of managing both sides, and I think that the way that they're doing it, their strategic autonomy, is actually going to benefit both parties, which is quite an interesting position to be in. I don't think it's really being stuck between a rock and a hard place. I think it's slightly better than that. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to discuss more of the European stuff, because there are a lot of things that I think will happen out here in the long term.
Now, I completely appreciate this. Actually, remarks by both Akshub and Surya. So, Saurabh, I'll now come to you, and maybe Samir can also jump in. So, uh, we know that India is a middle power by all means, and as a middle power, it has to look as how it will find its way anyways. And the analogy which Surya makes is quite interesting about how Indo-Russian studies will help the Quad, help US, help Europe in that sense. So um, I don't know if I'm correct on this, but you can correct me and the rest of the panelists also. If there are countries which have this kind of similar position like India in any part of the world, that's a different question altogether, because we all know that geopolitical and other kind of binaries are created or they exist due to a clash of interest in others, and that's a very basic 101 understanding of IR. But um, that's one question out of curiosity. And the second one which I have for you is, um, how does how should India look at it from a bit of a long term perspective, in the sense that while this hedging is going on and a sense of, I would say, perpetuation is there, um, do you look at the engagement between India and EU recently? Minister Jaishankar had an engagement with the European Union on data protection and other technological aspects. And Samir, if wishes, can jump in. And also, in India and Greece had an engagement, which means that the foreign minister of Greece had met the foreign minister, which is EAM of India. So even some European actors, I think even the Austrian minister, I think Austrian foreign minister also came to India recently. So these developments have happened, and we'll pivot to Europe in a bit. But how do you see them? And then we can get back to the US question afterwards. So here you go. Yeah.
Um, I would say that, I mean, let's just, I mean, the world is in flux. Like there's nothing certain right now. All the alignments, realignments, all is being reanalyzed. So we already see a lot of, like changes happening. You have like the West Asian, or what we call, like what the US calls Middle East. There's a lot of realignment. The Abraham Accords led to like rapprochement between like some Arab countries and Israel, and now the at least visible bond harmony between UAE and Israel is off the charts. Uh, we saw that the UAE, sorry, Israel, like was kind of asking the US to sell like jets to Egypt. So that's one area. And then I think I mean, India is the swing power or a middle power also because of its size. So there is no other country like India except China, in terms of size. But you have ASEAN as a swing, uh, like swing state, or like a region that can go either way depending on the geopolitics of the region or the day. You have Central Asia with now Russia becoming like more weak. We don't know how these sanctions will bite. We don't know how long the pain is going to last. How strongly can Russia maintain its sphere of influence in Central Asia remains to be seen. Like will China swoop in, or will the West try to fill the gap, or would India, with the help of some other countries, fill in the gap? And like given that no country in Africa or in South America also sanctioned Russia, shows that there is no unanimity on anything, or even like region wise. So I think my idea would be that countries are trying to figure out where they stand. I mean, the two poles are US and China, and the larger part being like US as like the West led group, and China is like the new emerging power. So at least the role for India, I see is that I think India would find its like would find it helpful to be on the side of the West, as long as it tries to, like, the main aim of the West or the US remains that to counter China. If the current situation in Europe, like misleads, the word being like if it leads US and the EU to refocus on Russia, then I think we have much less utility of the West or being close to USA, because our primary concern is China. And at least in terms of like regional dynamics, how the alignments are changing. We also see like the increasing like contacts between Pakistan and Russia. Like, so everybody is hedging. All the old partners are also hedging. India has like maintained neutrality kind of, and it's seeing its own interest, but it is slightly more critical of Russia than it was before. So you know because I think we have a lot more at stake with the West, at least in terms of current geopolitics. So I mean, that's kind of like my overview.
Great. So now let's come back to Europe, and we'll discuss Europe. But of course, as I had said, we'll discuss the US also, wherever. Now, I remember that the State Department spokesperson Ned Price had very clearly stated that India is a partner for that. I think they had said it for themselves. I can't remember right now, but I think they had said that for India, the US is a partner of choice. If that's exactly what he had said. And this is a very interesting remark because I think Victoria Nuland and Donald Lu had just visited on behalf of the US government. Um, Talking less about Victoria Nuland, considering her developments and her statements in the US Senate, but more on Donald Lu, I think one thing we see is that, uh, as Akshay points out about the congressman and women, I think the interesting part which I found was that the way the nuance existed in the State Department officials as far as engagement with India is concerned, because they had asked those kind of questions, which, if anyone watches right now on social media, such as YouTube and others, will say, you know what, oh, these are uh, uh, very weird questions and so forth, in that sense. Or there's something which are very, uh, like they're just the tip of the iceberg, they're not the iceberg in that sense. But still, the fact that the governments have a sense of nuance to engage in a long sense is very interesting. So I think one thing which is now becoming clear is that while the trajectory of cooperation of the Quad members will increase, which is anyways going to happen, the Quad is more in that consideration of whether it's critical tech, whether it is climate change, whether it is R&D and others. I think uh, we are going to see much more humble collaboration. Although recently Australia had invested, if I'm correct, in Indian rupees, if I'm saying 1,500 crores recently in India. Of course, they are not much as far as, because if you compare it with even a proper startup which is earned in India, its revenue and all of that stuff, but that's a different issue altogether. So I think Indo-Australian cooperation is also on a rise. I think Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison had a summit virtually. So I'm bringing Samir on to the panel in the sense to ask that when it comes to technology, the one thing which we generally see is that all of these kind of quote unquote crises, whether it is a pandemic, whether it is a kind of a conflict of international importance, or any kind of quote unquote war or situation which affects other areas. For example, Africa's dependence on Russian food grains and other things, and also when it comes to the whole crisis related to gas prices, right? So we see that interdependencies exist now in the domain of technology, and I would say uh, emerging technologies and both critical technologies. How do you see India creating its own way? Because um, uh, this is something which we have started discussing and we're already working on it, whether it is semiconductors or whether it is space or whether it is even investing in AI. How do you look at the contribution of the crisis and the current developments which have happened in this week, in the sense to say that, you know what, India has thought out new initiatives and new ideas to work its way? Because it's very much in India's interest to get global cooperation from the West and other actors as much as possible. That's what India tries to foster in, even with West Asian countries, for example. So how do you see it? And then I think maybe Akshob and Surya can add up. Yeah.
So I think we need to look at it from a very broader perspective. I think I just wanted to add this point that if you look at India's own neighborhood, which is quite unstable in the sense you have military dictatorships in some countries, then you have China. So I'm sure there will be some kind of a thinking also in the West that if India were to go down economically at this point in time, or for that matter, even politically, I think it's not going to be a good thing for the region in the entire in the Indo-Pacific region in the entirety. And secondly, also the fact that it's not only the Quad that is primarily working on these issues, there is also the new Quad that is coming up, the West Asia Quad. So there are a string of new, alliances and relationships that are coming up in the region. So I'm pretty sure there is going to be a balancing act looking at the long run. So I think we have just signed an FTA with UAE. We are soon going to, initiate one with Israelis. So in that sense, I'm sure there is going to be a lot of good things for India because especially with Israel, if you're talking an FTA, then I'm sure because Israel is a technology hub, a startup hub, there is going to be a lot of discussions relating to these areas. Secondly, if you look at the points that you raised regarding India's own domestic, how can I say, initiatives regarding setting up semiconductor industry or whatever. So, to be very honest, I'm not very optimistic because there are a lot of inherently major challenges within the country that we face as far as setting up industries like the semiconductors are concerned. Because even though there is some kind of an expertise in India in terms of semiconductors and stuff, there are a lot of other factors that need to be plugged in. Like, where are you going to bring in all the silicon, let's say, for the semiconductor industry? If you are like planning to have it in the next 5 years of $300 billion of exports, then you need at least $50 billion or something like that of silicon in India in order to have your ecosystem ready. So the amount of funding domestically, in my opinion, is not enough. And secondly, if you look at quantum technologies, for that matter, uh, it was in 2020 budget, if my memory serves me well, that the quantum mission of India was announced, but unfortunately there has been not much funding in that sense. So there are a lot of issues that need to be tackled with. I think we are lagging behind technologically, and of course, one way is through partnerships. But at the end of the day, I think if we really have to become self-reliant, I think we need to become technologically self-reliant. We are also seeing during this war the kind of misinformation on Western platforms, and Western platforms themselves, big tech, or for that matter, even SpaceX, becoming an arm of the American government, right? So these are some major issues that India has to really look at. I think our private sector needs to be really encouraged in that sense. So I think there needs to be a slew of initiatives, tax reforms, labor law reforms. So I think these are the primary factors that India should really look at before getting into or venturing into deals that might eventually be detrimental to our cause. So that is where I rest my case. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so
I can
that's
just
an
add.
interesting take.
Can I
You wish
just
to
add
add? Go
something?
ahead. Yeah.
Just
Please,
super
please,
quick
please.
on this. There was an report that came out. I think that they're kind of in a very critical phase in India right now on the semiconductor project. They've got I think 3 companies bidding for. Let me just check what that was. It was for the silicon part of it, and then there was another part that was just for the silicon fabrication, and I think here. Let me just check. Yeah, and they've got 3 for silicon fabs and 2 for display fabs. And I think that only about 1% of the total market right now with their $8 billion package that they want to deploy. It's a start. If they can get it off the ground, I think that it can meet some of the domestic requirements at least. And I think that in some ways, that's in the initial stages. I think that's probably enough to make sure that it safeguards some of the national security interests. I think at that level, right? For some of the defense projects that we're running, for some of the any project that's related to national security, if we can procure domestically, I think that would be great. And obviously there's a larger commercial angle to it, and I think that will develop organically as things move ahead, but it needs to get off the blocks in the beginning, and I think that has to be government subsidized. It needs to be government supported, and then you kind of start reaping the rewards down the line. The very idea in India that, look, you're not willing to spend upfront for longer term returns, I think that's something that in some ways this government, one of the areas where they've been strong in is kind of being willing to invest upfront for longer term returns, whether it's infrastructure, for example. One of the ways they're going about doing it with roads and ports. This is with the idea that it has a deflationary impact domestically in the long run. It improves efficiencies, it improves trade, it improves accessibility of businesses to points of export. It also it just harmonizes a domestic market as well, but also links up India to the world. You're able to tap domestic high purchasing power in the hinterland, especially with industries which can tap that and then kind of export out to the rest of the world. Now, the capabilities that those industries actually have technologically, that has to be ramped up. But what you're seeing is that this year we've had record exports from India, and there has been a significant addition in there's been a significant value addition in certain sectors of the exports this year, and it's a quantum leap from last year. Now, they may be small additional sort of value additions that things that have been added on, but I don't think it's a step back. It's actually a step forward, right? So the country's making the right moves. Um, it's also very difficult, I think, that to actually see the needle move on on an aggregate sales level, the revenue level, because it actually just the process of value addition takes time to kind of consolidate into what we really call economies of scale, where you can have very large um, uh, a large footprint in the global market of finished goods. It takes time. The Chinese took nearly 30 years to get there, 20 years, you'd say, at least, to get to this point. And it accelerated after they joined the WTO in 2001. For India, I think they need to find select areas and kind of work on those and dominate those industries globally, and especially at least in the Indo-Pacific, because that's where they need stability the greatest. You take a look at some of the other areas the Quad, I think, should be focusing on is the electric vehicle space and the green energy revolution that we're seeing globally. You're seeing very high energy prices, obviously. Some part of it is due to the crisis in Ukraine, but a lot of the inflation actually came before, and it was partly Federal Reserve driven, partly underinvestment, due to underinvestment in the energy space. Because it was considered a dirty fossil fuel, so they didn't want to invest in oil and gas. So there is a significant pressure to kind of move into electric vehicles. Now, I think that the PLI scheme for batteries, especially, is a very good move in this direction, because if you're able to manufacture these at home, that's fantastic. But what's very important in electronic vehicle supply chains is the actual natural resources that feed into all of this. And right now, 80% of all critical metals and rare earths are controlled by China. Now, this cannot persist if you want to create a stable ecosystem for yourself in India, or even if the US wants to create it, they can't possibly go down this route. One of the reasons why even Trump talked about buying out Greenland was for this purpose, right? Because it is there within the American strategic thought that they need to secure themselves in this space. Natural resource and energy security will be of, it came out in The Economist, but I work in this industry. I've been seeing this for a few years now. That's pressure building on countries to make sure that they secure themselves. It becomes exceptionally important now in a more fractured world, where China can access a lot of energy at cheaper rates from Russia, and they also control large parts of the electric vehicle supply chain, right from the raw materials to the production. um, and there's one element which I think I mentioned in one of the previous discussions we've had, Abhivardhan, was um, this deep ocean mission. They're going out there to really see what they can extract from the sea floor, from the seabed. These are high density nodules where they're able to get a lot of the critical metals required for battery manufacturing. Now, with what India has access to in the Indian Ocean region itself, under its exclusive economic zones, it can actually supply a lot of what is necessary for its industries to build out its batteries. Now, I don't know how much would be exported, but I know for a fact that it would go a long way to at least secure domestic requirements. Um, and I think that really has to be the focus. All countries are looking inwards. The U.S. is having a manufacture in America or make in America sort of thing. I mean, this is the exact same thing, which is like a make in India in a day, obviously for them. I know when we talked about Atmanirbhar Bharat, there were a lot of think tanks out there, American think tanks, which were talking about it as quite derisively, and saying that this is like a move inwards, and it's not really good. You're not being embedded in the globalized system. But globalism, in many ways, has already taken a body blow with this war. So a country like India has to actually focus on its domestic capabilities. It also, on top of this, that once you develop some domestic capabilities, you can export and you can stabilize supply chains for other countries, and make sure that you can replace China in some sectors. And I think that is really where where India's interests should lie. Now, to what extent are the Quad members really interested in this? I'd say that Japan, to some extent, is. Australia is now, given the change in government, and also the sort of uh, retribution that China gave to them. I think that they kind of realize where they stand. And then on top, but I don't think that the U.S. is fully on board. And Akshob, you might be able to give more insight into this. I just don't think that they're willing to decouple from China. And I think this is a real concern for India. And given these concerns, and they should be looking out just for themselves, because one, looking out for themselves actually helps the Quad in the long run if countries decide to kind of really decouple from China. And secondly, if they look out for themselves, they just simply look out for themselves, and it helps it helps India themselves. So I think that's really where things stand at the moment. And when you look at these moves into new sectors, the quantum mission, for example, it was like $1.1 billion or so. And I think that I'd written about this about a year and a half ago. I was quite excited about it. I really thought this can drive India forward, but the money is not there anymore, right? And if you have a weakened India that's struggling with its fiscal deficit, that's investing in infrastructure, and that's really the focus of the government, these kind of fall along the wayside, and you're not able to pick them up. This is not acceptable, right? It's not acceptable to the government. Therefore, it has to look out for making sure that its fiscal deficit does not blow out of proportion. It kind of takes care of its financial needs in the short term, and it's able to finance these critical projects, which will take India at least to a competitive level versus China, and also be able to engage with the world in a way that it can stabilize supply chains and make sure that there is a hedge for the world. There's one more element which is slightly different, which I wanted to mention. I talked about it in my article. Russia moving too close into the Chinese orbit is not something that is good for the Quad. The closer it goes, the higher the likelihood that China will use Russia in ways which the West will not be happy with, in ways that we may not even expect at the moment. Both in the Western theater, in the Atlantic, and in the Pacific theaters. That's really not the place where the West would like to see themselves. And so when I think it was you, sort of, who was talking about like hedging and hedging the risks. That's really what Russia would like to see. In some ways, they've done this in the Middle East. They've got a few countries together that are willing to kind of play Moscow off Washington, but India plays an even larger role because of its deep defense ties with Russia. Russia would be more than happy to keep arming India as much as possible and working on joint ventures, as India would really like to indigenize more things. But that really is a counterbalance to China, so China does not feel that it can extract its pound of flesh from Russia every single time. So I don't think anyone in Moscow would want to make their country a vassal state of China. So India plays a role here in doing this. Everybody in the West is just looking at Ukraine, and that's really just very short-termist. That crisis it may drag on, or it may blow over this year, but that crisis it's not the only crisis that's going to exist. The world is going to continue you have to look at it from a 10 to 20 year horizon. But does the US domestically, do they have the capability of looking 10, 20, 15 years, 20 years down the road? I think that they're really struggling domestically and on the political front, because they really need to just look at achieving short-term objectives to placate their domestic audience. It's very interesting because that was the position that India has been in for very long, right? And I think that the domestic elections and the national elections that we have seen have given the government a little bit more leeway to look longer term. In the US, you've seen the reverse. They're there's too many political changes domestically, which kind of put pressure, whichever government there is, to kind of toe a particular line which suits their local audience, and that has ramifications for the Indo-Pacific economic and security architecture in the long run. So the only thing they did know this time, and I just want to conclude on this, was that they need to consolidate their sphere of influence, and they did it. In a very brutal fashion. They did it by seizing assets, central bank assets, individuals' assets. They went out there and they said, you know what, we don't care about due process anymore. We're going to do what we need to do to curtail Russia and hurt them where, hit them where it hurts. But that they're not taking into account the problems that this sort of behavior will have for the long term in terms of outward investment from China and India potentially in the future in the West. Why would an Indian company want to go out there? There was a very interesting thing, move by the by the government not to allow companies to get listed, domestic companies to get listed overseas. Why? It came at a very interesting time. I don't think that the Indian government is worried that they're going to seize Indian assets overseas right now, but of course everyone would be thinking that, look, this can happen and they can draw everything down to zero. And this is tail risk that has been added into every company's financial models now. That there's a 0.1% chance that the valuation of anything that we have can go down to zero. We can get nationalized overseas. Is this good business? Is this good economics? No. But these core principles were sacrificed for geopolitical hegemony, to ensure geopolitical hegemony by the US overseas. And they need to do a lot to kind of turn this, especially in the minds of Indians, so that they need to come out and say, we're going to invest in India. Here's 40, 50 billion. Japanese are doing far more than the Americans, right? Why is that happening? The Americans have even more money, but they should be going out there and saying, look, here's $50 billion for this particular industry. We're going to set up our battery manufacturing here in India. Simple, right? We're going to get all our stuff made here and export it to the US. But they want to go into their own manufacturing cycle, start a new one. So in some ways, there are conflicts of interest between India and the US in this in this space, So, but if they really want a stable Indo-Pacific, they need to the West needs to be a little bit more cognizant of Indian concerns.
Just one point regarding energy that Surya raised. I'm sure the EV industry, it's not only lithium that is going to be the actor. So they're also looking at hydrogen and green hydrogen, which are as potential, vectors for energy within India. So I'm sure there is a lot of cooperation that is happening on this front, especially with the Quad partners. So that is something that India should seriously contemplate and look at, try to create an ecosystem for green hydrogen, potentially even look at exports. That will definitely benefit us, not only cater to the domestic, requirements, but also as probably an exporter of green hydrogen, given such a huge resource potential, especially with our refining industry. And green hydrogen production should not be a very big deal for us. So I think we should look at that very seriously.
And Reliance is looking at it, right? This is these companies are the leaders of these companies are very sharp. They see things that the media, frankly, just doesn't even think about, because the media is staffed with people who are not always the most clued up on and most forward thinking. The business people, the ones who run large industries, they see things in the future. The ones that have been very successful. And I think Ambani is particularly prescient in his calls, and I think he sees hydrogen as one of the major areas of potential investment, which is why he's willing to put like $12 billion behind it. It's not a small amount of money.
I think Akshob can, of course, respond and have his comments, and then we can discuss about China, considering the Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit, and then we can conclude. So, Akshob, here to you.
Yes, just a couple of things. Obviously, a lot of impact. I would actually say that fundamentally in the last few years, I don't only want to live in the US India space, but by virtue of being Washingtonian here, that's a space I end up occupying or being part of rather. Um, um, just if you just think about it, right? Just think about it in the last 75 years. What you really have to define the relationship as it's gone from aid to trade, right? Or from a sense of estrangement to engagement. Like Johnson, Indira Gandhi meetings in the 60s were PL 480 food subsidies, right? And though that was dangled like a carrot, that was withdrawn when India did not back the United States and Vietnam, which was a transgression and everything, which was fundamentally abhorrent for a lot of people against a violation of another country's sovereignty and another country's human rights. But when that happened, that was pulled away. And if you just think about the first 50 years, you only had three presidents visiting India: Eisenhower, Nixon, and Carter. And even then, Indian-US relations in the 70s had another, especially under the Nixon Kissinger regime, which was, of course, history and now judges them as the proper villains. But in that last 25 years, you've had five presidential visits, two from Obama and one from each one power. Biden, of course, has not yet made a visit, but that could change. You have to see the kind of engagement that's kind of happened, and in the fact that Surya touched on record exports at 400 billion this year. I think 113 of that was largely just from the United States alone. The India-United States trade partnerships around 150. Look, there's no trade deal just yet, and that's because a lot of other issues. Right, one is there's no political appetite right now in the US for such a trade deal. There's also pushback in India that way, and there's a lot of minutia that still needs to be solved. Market access, India's GSP got withdrawn in 2019. That's something that the Congress has to reinstate. So, but you've had the restart of the Trade Partnership Forum when Catherine Tai visited the USTR visited India in November, and all of a sudden you've seen small things happen like alpha lahe and cherries from the United States coming in, mangoes from India, which is very sacrosanct and worshipped in the US, had been completely kept aside. Mangoes in the United States come from Mexico. Real pulp, no fiction there. So what's really going to happen right now is more and more, and what TPF is going to do is kind of erode some of the barriers. Now, Prime Minister Goyal at a summit last year said that he wants by 2030 hopes that the India-US trade can hit $1 trillion of trade. We're at 150 now, and that's still less than 1/5, right? So for that to happen, there still has to be a lot more political appetite to get a trade deal done, to understand that the market of fundamentally private sector companies understand the potential of India's market as well. And what's happened right now is, I know we touched on supply chains as well, and because one of the sacrosanct foundations of the Quad is resilient supply chains, because what COVID did is fundamentally show a couple of things. One is that you cannot have a system where things that slow down in China means things that slow down the rest of the world. It's just cataclysmic right now. I mean, we live in a sort of market, a global market where you do have alternates, and the fact that China has such a monopoly and a hegemony in the manufacturing space, it just kind of showed that supply chain disruption in China meant that supply chain disrupted the world. And we're still not out of that yet. We still have a supply chain crisis that we saw from Christmas this year. And fundamentally, with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, that supply chain crisis is going to get worse right now. We're already seeing countries like Egypt and Morocco and Turkey, which are reliant on Russian wheat, not getting it. India is still imports a lot of its sunflower oil from Russia and Ukraine. And that's been another crisis as well. And I'm not even going to touch on the energy part, because we already know about the energy crisis going on. What's going to happen right now is, as part of the supply chain crisis, India kind of moves. The Make in India part is not just what Atmanirbhar Bharat and self-reliant India is not just about. It's not autarky, it's not inward looking. The economy is far more global, far more intertwined. And we also see that with sanctions. Well, sanctions don't just have one market, because it's octopus arms. And there are various flows. So you can't just sanction one source and assume that nothing happens, right? What's going to happen now is countries have kind of realized that you need a China plus one strategy, China plus four, China plus five strategy. The manufacturing aspect that India did in 2014, 2015, and Make in India and Niti Aayog and Amitabh Kant leading it, was because India's fundamental history kind of went from agrarian to services, skipping a lot of the manufacturing, right? Like right from the Green Revolution, and when India went from food shortage to food surplus. And then the 91 reform just, exploded India's technological prowess on the stage, something that initially Rajiv Gandhi had shown influence for the tech sector and Narasimha Rao, and then But India never really capitalized the manufacturing. Doesn't mean India does not have manufacturing from cotton, jute, silk, textile. Yes, India has a robust manufacturing sector, but and even for automobiles as well. And we've seen that Korean, Japanese car manufacturers, but high-end manufacturing, where you're trying to woo in from the semiconductor space. What really made Taiwan one of the East Asian miracles? I mean, this is a country that has had to have big. I mean, we're talking about India's security threats with China. We're talking about the United States being paranoid with China and the Indo-Pacific ASEAN countries. But that's been Taiwan's story. It's always had the dragon over it because it fundamentally China never recognized Taiwan's right to exist as a sovereign entity. And the United States has also adopted. I mean, the whole world sort of most of the world has a China, the one China policy. But despite that, economically, Taiwan's been able to exceed expectations, including trade with China, which of course a lot of people have used as a benchmark for India, Pakistan, but that's flawed for a different reason. But the semiconductor space, with what you have with Foxconn and other things, and India's move to high-end manufacturing still has to be there. But because traditionally, if you think about it, even in India, the southern and the western states have done better. The northern and the eastern states have been a little more derelict on this, and that obviously gets into more public administration issues. But because of the 12 to 15 million workforce joining every year, because of the fact that India's kind of moved from just the back end of the world industry to now you've got front-facing CEOs, but manufacturing still has to be a core component because since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, which of course did hamper Indian economic growth, because of course that was very egregious colonial policies back then, what really benefited Manchester to hurt workers back at home. But since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, manufacturing has been very sacrosanct for country's economy. I mean, the United States, being the world leader in the 20th century, was largely manufacturing driven, right? From Ford automobile engines. So in what Trump's Trump's rise to power was largely based on Make America Great Again, which was about bringing back manufacturing, bringing back Harley Davidson to Wisconsin. That obviously won't happen necessarily, but China right now is moving to, as it's gone more affluent and was some of the highest high net worth individuals in the world. China is moving toward the purchasing power model of moving to a more consumption-driven model in the United States. So that vacuum of the manufacturing space was more open for India, and I think unfortunately Thailand and Bangladesh and Vietnam have done a better job in occupying that space a little better, especially Bangladesh. If you think about it, just in the 50 years, a more report came out, and this is not to segue too much, but this is fascinating for a country that was born out of a bloody war, with seeds from its western part and has overtaken its erstwhile western identity, because it never saw itself through a security military state as compared to focusing more on individual human development aspects as well as manufacturing part. I mean, this is definitely Bangladesh's shining beacon yet, but it's definitely punched above its weight in some aspects in manufacturing. So I think make an Indian Atmanirbhar Bharat, because Atmanirbhar Bharat also speaks about, look what's happening right now, right? We're talking about India being reliant on Russia for military. It's not reliant. It's because India understands that countries that inherently have been transactional, right? In the past, the United States and India never really had the defense partnership for 50 years until now, right? You're talking about it as from 98, there was Clinton sanctions for Pokhran testing. That changed with the civil nuclear deal a decade later. But that defense partnership wasn't there for so long. Even if you look at the Indian defense scholars, will tell you, hold on a minute, what really helped us in Kargil was Israeli defense technology in spotting it. And the fact that there's a pliant and flexibility with Russian manufacturing, the fact that you can still do mid-fifth generation developments, you can still get spare parts and maintenance from the Russian suppliers far easier than you can get from a Lockheed and Boeing, which have different level of scrutinies and rules. What also helps with India's perspective there is the fact that India looks at defense manufacturing through like a mutual fund thing, right? You don't put everything in one basket. So you've got Russia, you've got Israel, you've got France, and you've got the United States in terms of your larger supplies. But Atmanirbhar Bharat also means, hold on a minute, it's indigenization of Indian defense. You need to move more towards indigenization because fundamentally, as per the laws of a country's industrialization, the more sophisticated, with science of technology and manufacturing, the more a defense equipment happens, the more defense manufacturing happens. But a little less procurement and more, and you've seen that with the Gilded Age in the United States, and Russia's always had a strong military industrial complex there. Even in the Soviet Union era, Russia's military industrial complex is on par with anyone else. And that is this indigenization of Indian defense has been that's part of Atmanirbhar Bharat. So it's not a sense of autarky as well. So fundamentally, right now, as you think about supply chains also being disrupted, right now with what the Quad's also trying to do is in terms of resilient supply chains is one is understanding that it's not just a China hegemony with manufacturing. Two is taking away or mitigating China's carrots in the region, right? Like we spoke about EV and solar. China's outdone the United States in West Africa for that, from Senegal to Mali and everything, providing cheap solar technology. What India is trying to do in that, so what the Quad is trying to do is countries which do have the sword of Damocles over the head in terms of ASEAN nations, see a sense of ASEAN's codify a sense of ASEAN centrality, which it hasn't been necessarily because even in the ASEAN regions, if you think about it, countries like Thailand haven't said anything because Thailand's whole it goes in again goes into Thailand's history of adroit statecraft, how it was the only country not colonized in a region which had the British, the French, and the Dutch, and everyone else. And countries like Laos and Myanmar still very very heavily dependent on Chinese investments as well. Countries like Cambodia still depend on China. Have not spoken out. It's only the ones that have direct conflict with the practice in the Paracel Islands that do feel a Chinese hegemony there. And so, how do you mitigate that for those countries by promising better investments? And the fact that even what you saw with the BRI, it's still more nebulous. No one really knows what goes into those. And you've seen how in the region, right from Ambanpur's white elephants, right from what happens in Maldives, right from what happens in Myanmar and other countries, that there is a sense of Chinese investments being debt traps. So how do you come with cleaner, secure, stronger investments? Which is why everything what the Quad is at a kernel level promising is supposed to mitigate the Chinese red envelopes that come in the form of gratuitous investments that, and we also saw India's foothold in Iran. I know it's a little more West Asia facing, right from the Chabar port has sort of diminished because China and Iran signed a strategic 25-year partnership where China, of course, also imports a large amount of energy. Iran needed to counter sanctions as well, and China's a good market. And what does China say in West Asia? What China says in West Africa, what China says in Latin America. That, we don't care about ideology, unlike the Americans, who have always given investments based on, a sense of political ideology that they are coalesce with. Of course, there are exceptions to that in some parts of, like Saudi Arabia. But you need road, railway infrastructure, ports. What's wrong with that? And I think most countries see Chinese investments. The weaker countries do see, no weaker, sorry. The more countries more amenable to robust investments, do see that as an attractive investment. So that's where the asymmetry of power has been, and that's where I think the Quad, and now even in West Asia, the West Asian Quad, after the Abraham Accords, is trying to mitigate some of that. So I think those are just some thoughts. I know we've kind of traversed a bit of the globe there, but back to central headquarters.
Just one point I just wanted to make.
Sure.
This regarding the startup ecosystem in Europe, for example. So if the sanctions are going to go on for a while now, then I'm sure there is going to be a lot of recession that is going to happen in Europe, and that paves way for Chinese investment to move in, right? Although Surya just made a point on people being afraid of investments in the West if this is going to be the case, if countries get sanctioned left, right, and center. So that is one concern I really have. If there is a lot of Chinese investment going into Europe, with MSME sector especially, that is going to crumble absolutely. This we saw already in 2008 when the financial crisis happened. So I think that is something that we really need to look out for, and I think that is one area that India and Europe perhaps can look at and target for any kind of Indian investment, or for that matter skill development programs within India for Indians to go and work in Europe or things like that. So I think there is a lot of scope in this domain, and I think nobody is talking about this.
In fact, one of the things that one of the possible outcomes is obviously a deindustrialization of Europe with high energy prices, and you may end up seeing a lot of German companies, French companies, say more so German, looking at shifting manufacturing base to China. That what that essentially will end up doing is that a lot of high-end technologies which exist in Germany, which they've kind of specialized in, as the lower end of their manufacturing has moved out, they've still kept a large section of their high-end manufacturing, that may end up moving. And if that moves, we know what happens typically with reverse engineering and IP theft. And the companies may end up moving their manufacturing to China, essentially held hostage by the Chinese government, just like how now companies are held hostage by the Western Bloc politically, right? They can say that they can they can just grab these assets whenever they want. The Chinese can easily do the same if those units are based in China. So this is a very dangerous shift which could happen, and that all that will do is further develop Chinese capabilities against not just the United States, but also, its adversaries in the neighborhood. A small example of this: Russia is going to find it difficult to expand its LNG export capacities, capacity across its coast, because some of that liquefaction technology, where they turn gas into liquid and put it onto the ship, that technology they have still not mastered. Even the Chinese have not mastered it. There are a few German companies that are particularly good at this, and a few American companies that can do it. You would have thought that, given Russia's technological capabilities in other areas, or China's capabilities in certain areas, they would have mastered this by now, but they haven't. So they're dependent on this technology. Now, these are things which would be in the eye line of Beijing and Moscow in the long run. So this is just one example, but I'm talking about even other high-end technologies within quantum computing and other areas that, or even the biological sciences space. The Germans are particularly advanced in this biotechnology and biological sciences. So these things, if they start moving abroad, and into China, there will be serious problems, and they really don't want that to happen. I would assume the U.S. would be cautious of that happening. How will they prevent it? I actually don't know. Because I think they've got themselves into a bit of a mess. Because if you have a deep you either have two options. You have high inflation that persists over the next 2 years, or you end up with a recession that really, with reasonably high inflation for the next 2 years, right? Maybe less inflation than if you have than if you keep pumping the market with money. The Europeans want to keep printing money. They want to finance their energy new energy bill that they've got. I mean, how long can they keep doing this? I really don't know. I think that Europe is on the precipice right now. It's going to take something very special to pull them off this. I don't know what it's going to be, but if you start seeing a structural decline of Europe, what Samir, you were saying about Chinese companies, in some way or another, they will try and grab their share. And the Russians are not going to be far behind, because they will be able to fracture Europe politically eventually in the long run. And the Chinese will do that work of going in to grab the assets or the technology or the IP, whatever it may be. So this is actually going down the future. Like, if you go back into the past, Europe was always fractured, right? In fact, a lot of its innovation came from the fact that it was fractured, and there was a lot of competition between countries. It's going back to that. But before you get back to the healthy competition side of things, you're going to go down the rabbit hole first before you can dig yourself out of it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll get on China, but I'll just refer to a very, since Surya talked about quote unquote a fractured Europe. I remember this remark by somebody who said that if the European Union, and just a remark I'm making up, not my remark, somebody else's, that if a European Union is economically and politically not that capable, because I remember an article published in ORF, I always talk about it, that the EU is the new NAM. It was by, I think, Angad Singh Chaudhary. So very interesting article. And if the EU becomes the new NAM, interestingly, then somebody suggested, I think Roger suggested, that EU can be bifurcated into West EU and the East EU, or maybe Central East EU. But again, that's a figment of imagination for fun I just raised for the viewers, listeners, and the panelists. So let's get on China. Now, I'm really happy that we have pivoted our discussion and centralized on China and Chinese concerns. Um, I completely understand the fact that when the foreign minister Wang Yi came to India, and I also related to this funny development on Twitter and social media where I see Chinese embassies posting the content of a prominent news channel where a particular anchor is basically heckling at a particular US professor. But that's a different game altogether, which is very good for Indian media PR. But, anyways, so the foreign minister visits India, and the responses by Dr. Jaishankar have been quite clear about how they look at the China relationship. It's very evident that it is not a normal relationship. He says that if China, of course, he doesn't say that, but it's very implied that if China says that India's foreign policy should be quote unquote independently guided, which in many ways it is, anyways, then then China should also do the same. It should not be based on reciprocities of other countries, right? How they shape China's interest in that sense. So, I mean, that's a statement which was given by Dr. Jaishankar, and I'm just trying to recall it. So let's start on this, and then we'll conclude fast. So, Akshul, the question is to you. How would the US look at this development of the Indo-China meeting, in the sense that negotiations are still happening on the military front, and we know that unless the status quo ante is not received, I don't think, in my view, any larger development will happen. We also know how the US has cooperated with India on handling with China as far as the whole Galwan clash was concerned in 2020. So, how do you see it? And then, yeah.
Yeah, so couple of things there, right? Firstly, right now, given Washington's preoccupation and largely global occupation of the crisis in Ukraine, uh, anything that deters anything that does not that is towards a quote unquote a peace process, or anything that's stability sort of welcome, because at some point there are only, even for the mighty super, only so much balls up in the air that one can handle. While yes, China still poses a largely hegemonic threat in the Indo-Pacific region, which is now sacrosanct to Washington. They would kind of welcome this sort of little surprising diplomatic overture that came from Beijing, not from New Delhi. It came from Beijing. You see Wang Yi right now also in Nepal and Kathmandu, so it's sort of a South Asia sort of outreach. That's the first part. The second part is I think what if you look at the kind of comments that are coming, it came out from the Indian establishment, was very, very similar to what traditionally that, in the last 15 years, where China has become the largest security threat, the way the comments used to be reserved for something like Islamabad is like, can't have a normal relationship until, the terror and talks don't go hand in hand. Can't have a normal relationship in this. And that's now become with border disputes, border clashes. The fundamental thing is, look, I think if you look at what Chinese experts in Delhi and Indian diplomats in Beijing have said, look, Prime Minister Modi actually really believed in a possible China dialogue, right? And this came from his own economic incentive when he was chief minister of Gujarat and made trip to Shenzhen and Guangzhou and wanted to get those investments. And Xi had come to Delhi many times, and he had made trips to Beijing, including the Xi'an trip, to Xi's hometown. There, of course, you had the Doklam standoff, which of course was diplomatically was a very significant way of handling it, right? Like, and you thought that, all right, you had the Wuhan summit, which is long before COVID became COVID. Wuhan summit was known as, the one where Modi and Xi met and at the reset, and then the follow-up reset in Mamlapuram. In a lot of ways, I think Modi really wanted to see it as this Kissinger-Nixon moment, like a détente to China. Even though India-China relations were never needed that détente, there was just never. It was, it was a belief of walk and chew gum at the same time. That is, that the fact that the economic trade relationship had not been impacted while the border disputes had never been settled, right? Right from over years. But there was an assumption that, look, there's never been a sense of fighting across the border. There, the Nantula Pass has been okay. The McMahon line has never been, there's been issues on Arunachal. There's been issues on some other parts of the line, but there's never been something that can't be handled. And after Doklam, when you thought you had Wuhan and Mamlapuram, And then Galwan, of course, was the height of COVID, and while China was still reeling from one of the worst crises ever, that, of course, has just angered the psyche for so many people. It was sort of a crisis of confidence with any sort of economic bonhomie with China that people saw possible, right? That shattered it to the point where uh, in 2017, 2018, if you hear what some of the leading diplomats would have said was, oh, India in BRICS precludes it from looking as anti-America, and India in Quad prevents it from looking as anti-China. And now that's fundamentally right from the fact that India did not mince any words with the clashes in Galwan. It was far more brutal than what people expected. It was a violation of a lot of territorial integrity. It was what happened after that was, of course, you saw the exodus of Chinese companies in from TikTok, ByteDance, getting their boot out, and many other companies. With Huawei also trying to vie for 5G, that kind of got mitigated because for many times in the United States, China has been seen as the small yard high fence. That is, they'll post-Trump administration, Biden looked at it as a small yard high fence. And what do I mean by that? It's like there'll be engagement with China economically, but there'll still be the security threat that China poses, particularly with tech companies. And India has now gotten that as well with China. That there'll still be the trade, albeit has gotten diluted, but hasn't been cut off completely. It hasn't. There's been no downgrading in diplomatic ties like the way Pakistan did post 2017. But that sense of economic rapprochement that was belief that was there has now been shattered. And plus, of course, COVID has not helped China's cause in any sense, no way as well. And India has now become a far more vocal member of the Quad, even though it's never, one could say the Quad is never about China, but everything about it is of China, right? With free, a free and open Indo-Pacific, rules-based international order for democracies. It's kind of like a, name the elephant in the room is always a dragon, and I think that's where India now takes a first stance. I mean, so why this thing is very important to put into context is it's not a reset, right? It's Beijing's overture. I think the sense that you get from Delhi, as we rightly spoke about at the start of this call, is forgive me, is that with the foreign minister making a statement that he did was exactly what you would have seen for comments from Islamabad in the past, that you cannot forget about border disputes and border skirmishes and pretend that you can't wash away with this. And I think Galwan has still scarred in a lot of ways, and there's still a lot more unresolved issues within just the immediate 2020 issue, let alone the larger frameworks in 62. And I think what that's going to mean is, the way I also saw Wang Yi's visit was to try and see where India is going to be with the BRICS summit and the RIC summit. Don't forget, China is playing host this year to the BRICS summit, which also will be more interesting for the global community now because Russia is, in the eye of the storm. And if you look at what Medvedev from Russia also said, is that, oh, there's a new Russia, India, China, quote unquote, it's an axis, I think, happening, which of course is not exactly true, but which means that if the BRICS summit has to continue with the way it has, Wang Yi sort of had to kind of iron out whatever he could iron out before getting a sense of what the BRICS summit is going to be. Because don't forget, India and the US will have a 2+2 in April. There will be the Quad summit in Japan. To ensure that India's participation in the BRICS is not unencumbered by Galwan, which is, and how it will go on. And don't forget, India is still part of SCO, which has Pakistan as well. And on the Central Asian nations, and that is largely BRI-based investments driven there. So I think what's going to happen is this is sort of what I would see as sort of setting the notion for BRICS and RIC, but it's not a reset. There's still more issues unresolved, and it's not a one Mamlapuram reset. I don't see a Modi Xi thing happening right away, but that could change. So I think I'll leave that for now.
I guess Surya wishes to raise some points. He can do so,
Yeah.
followed by Samir, followed by Saurabh. Saurabh, you can give the final remarks, and then we can conclude. I think discussing about the dragon in the grizzly dragon bear of Montana is important. So, Surya, you go ahead.
Absolutely. Just a few final comments. I mean, picking up from where Akshob left off, I think when we look at what China's plans are for the future, in some ways it's got to a very interesting demographic point where the average age is in the 40s. It's ridden this manufacturing and export wave for nearly 30 years. It's kind of edged ahead of the world using the COVID crisis in many ways to kind of get within touching distance of the US. And it still intends to retain, hegemony over certain key strategic supply chains globally to make sure that they still are the central pole, which can kind of be the lever everywhere and can kind of expand geopolitically on the back of its economic entrenchment globally. But at the same time, I think it's going to look more inwards. It's going to focus significantly on its domestic consumption. There are still very large, 70% of its population is still not wealthy. When we look at the 30% of the 1.5 billion, that's a very large number, which is kind of what we see as the prosperous China. There's a very large section of China which is not prosperous as yet. It's kind of got a lot of its basics in order for those people. The government has made sure it's that they're pakka houses, as we say in India, for them. Their water connections and kind of what India is doing now. In many ways, the Chinese have already delivered over the last 20 years. But beyond this, you see a slowdown in the real estate space. You see a slowdown in certain areas. So they kind of want to focus on domestic consumption. That was something that Xi Jinping even talked about earlier. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. He kind of was discussing this. So you probably will end up seeing a slightly more inward-looking China, but an inward-looking India as well, which is willing to also engage deeply with the West. If the West is willing to kind of depart from the 2005 idea, which is kind of still lurking about of a G2 world, right? It's fascinating that in the U.S., when there was this idea floated when China was around a $3 trillion economy in 2005. Brzezinski came up with this idea back then because they looked at China from the long term and they saw their own investments in China and they saw what trajectory that was going to take. And that trajectory actually, it panned out exactly how they expected in many ways, that they strengthened China's hands through heavy investment in technology transfer. And also they knew what China was going to do with the technology and IP. They have not actually articulated anything of that kind for India. They perhaps in many ways they do not think that in the US they do not think that India is going to match China in the future, even though India is probably at the same level where China was in 2005, which is actually a very telling sign. I think that should be an indicator for India that it has to manage its affairs using by securing itself, managing its natural resource supply chains, developing its own manufacturing base, and where possible, creating interdependencies both in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So, what does this mean when you look at China's engagement with India? I think recently, Wang Yi's visit, perhaps, I think that there's one problem with, taking a step back. I think there's one problem that the CCP in general has. They're not able to assess the mood in democracies very well. Because they tend to be very closed off. So, despite all their capabilities in many other spheres, they do not understand. At least many times they don't understand how much domestic pressures can actually influence democratic outcomes within the foreign policy space. So the anti-China sentiment that developed from 2020 is not something that they could really comprehend in many ways. Yes, the people were keen to kind of shun Chinese goods for the short term, but they kind of got back onto it because it is a low-income country. And China does have that very affordable price point for its products. But at the same time, the sentiment has not died down, the anti-China sentiment in India. And I think that the US also should be aware that the anti-Western sentiment that the press has been kind of fomenting in the country through their very vitriolic attacks against democracy and the way this country functions is not really something which will go down well in the long run for the Indo-US relationship. Despite what Akshob is saying is that it's stable and it's on the upswing. There will be some pressures domestically to kind of stay away in certain ways and manage the relationship with the US as much. No, obviously not in the same way that India deals with China, but there will be a certain degree of caution. So all in all, like, when you see how, coming back to the point about China, I think that they're uh, the Chinese and Russian angle, which is that, oh, India is kind of now on the Russians, on their side in this battle to reorder the world. I don't think anybody were any capable diplomat or politician in India will believe this. They know that this is not the case. That they have to just carve out their own niche. And these are growing pains, and that's exactly what I would like to term it. These are growing pains for India, as it kind of establishes itself on the world stage. You start becoming a serious player when you are in that 4 to 6 thousand dollar per capita sort of income. Even if you're a very large country like India, then you're in that 5-7 trillion dollar sort of space. You can really start pulling some more levers. And it's not just about the notional value, as we have seen with this crisis in Ukraine, and as we have seen over the last 20 years since China joined the WTO. It is about how many interdependencies you have created across the world, and you've cultivated, and how much leverage you can exercise through this. And no financial model which looks at company returns, revenues, or longer term sort of GDP outlooks can ever compensate necessarily for this, because scale has its own value, and it's scale and market share, and that's exactly what the Chinese have mastered. India should be able to master that in some areas, and cultivate that. And the Quad is a good platform to get India to do this, but it requires its partners, and especially the United States, to come on board. And I think that there's a degree of hesitancy that exists at the moment. That needs to change. What will change it? I'm not so sure, because Akshob talked about a hesitancy about a sort of trade deal with the U.S. Trade deal aside, that's not exactly necessary. It's about investments. It's about creating about the U.S. feeling that, look, there are some areas where we can be dependent on India. They're happy to be dependent on China, at least in many areas. They're not. They're actually cutting tariffs on Chinese goods, but they're not doing this with India, and that requires a very serious discussion, which I don't see happening, and I don't see any discussion in the press either on this. So, yeah, I mean, it's not the most positive note to end things on, but I do hope that this changes if you want to have a mutually beneficial sort of relationship, and you want a stronger India in the long run.
Yeah, I think Samir will make his remarks. Just, I would say, a very accidental welcome to Rishabh. So what we'll do is that, Saurabh and Rishabh, you can make final remarks, and Samir, you can just jump in fast so that we can conclude.
Abhivardhan,
But
I'll be having
anyway,
to go, but thank you for
yeah,
hosting this, and
yeah,
I'll be joining you next time. Cheers.
definitely,
Thanks.
definitely. Was happy to have you. We'll happy to have you again. Yeah, yeah, great.
So I
So
think I
Samir,
completely agree with whatever Akshob and Surya just mentioned. I think, to be very honest, there are not many points to be left, but just the fact that if India really wants to be a global player, then the first thing that India needs to sort out is energy security first. Secondly, look for manufacturing whichever way it's possible. If you want to establish critical mineral supply chains, then at least do the refining part in Australia or US, bring them back. So in this way, you'll also be looking at your tariff barriers, right? So there are a lot of things that India needs to do domestically. Look at from a very holistic point of view, so that it will become easier. So energy security number one, then access to minerals number two, and look at technology. Please invest in technology. Please invest in research and development. Unfortunately, our funding in science and technology R&D is very little, and I think there needs to be an integrated approach, like in China, where you have just one funding agency that is for both defense as well as civilian purposes. I think we need to get into the domain in order to accelerate things. So that is all I wanted to say. Thanks. Thank you so much for the opportunity, by the way, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
definitely, and it would be a pleasure to host you again. I think Saurabh can make his remarks, and then Rishabh can just come with his final point. So yeah,
Yeah, thanks. So I mean, I think enough has been talked about geoeconomics. I'd like to talk about like geopolitics. I would say once the Russia-Ukraine crisis blows over, I think I think India should have a serious discussion with the US and the EU counterparts of like what role do they see for Russia in the global politics? Because I think, as Surya said, in terms of hedging, I mean, I think China has like found a very nice and cheap way to hedge against its neighbors that can be very powerful, or its adversaries, by using Pakistan against India, North Korea against Japan and South Korea, and now Russia, which was like not like a ally or a partner or a vessel. But I think if Russia is sufficiently like downgraded in terms of its economics, and like with all of these sanctions biting, we may seem like we may find Russia in a situation where the elites or the people would not like to be a vassal state to China because of history, and like their own self perception of like Russia, but they might not have any choice. So if that happens, like it would be like Russia again is a nuclear power. It's a P5 power. So it is not just like another random country. It is not like so for China can easily use Russia, or push buttons with Russia to create trouble in Europe, or to US interests elsewhere. So US would then have to like either take a choice that like European countries, you make a choice. You take care of your own security. I am out, and I'll focus more on China. But that might be very difficult given the historical linkages that US has with Europe. So even now, like Russia, like the US is not as involved in terms of arms and supplies, or I mean, it's more into sanctions. But I think we need to have a serious discussion, because it's not even in India's interest to have a Russia that's like very significantly dependent on China. I think China may want that with Russia, but I think it's not in our interest. And I would say, at least in terms of like what was talked about, if there is prolonged recession and economic crisis in Europe, how that might help China or Chinese companies. I think like the level of being naive that the European countries and the US were in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, it is not there anymore. I think these countries realized that like China was buying their IP and their companies on the cheap. We have a very famous example of Syngenta, like a major biopesticide company in Europe, which was taken over by China for very cheap. I think so. China, use their IP for their own companies, and so I think the countries will be more careful this time. But if they are drilling under economic pressure, it might not be as easy to say like we worry about China, but they also need to like not have a recession. So maybe India can swoop in. Maybe India, along with other countries, can maybe use an example that, hey, Europe or West, you may be skeptical of Chinese investments given past precedent. So how about I invest in your country, or you offshore some of your industries to India, so that if the IP stays with you somewhat, and you can take advantage of cheap labor or the cheap industrial ecosystem that hopefully would be with India in due course of time, as was the case in China with China like 15 years ago. Um, I mean, that's essentially what I would like to say. But I think we need to have a discussion with the Western counterparts about how much of a hedge do they see Russia against China. I think because India can be like a bridge between Russia and the West, because I don't see like any uh, normalization happening between Russia and the West, anytime soon, given the scale of like conflict. Even if in the wildest of dreams there is a change of regime in Moscow, I think these things tend to like remain as a scar for a very very long time. So it would be very difficult for any Russian leader, even after Putin, to just say, hey, let's just forget what happened in 2022 and just let's start over. So I think it is in our interest to like they pick some brains with our friends or allies in Europe and US.
Great. So I know that Rishabh joined a bit late, but it's fine. Rishabh, you can add your final points, and then I think we'll conclude. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, sorry, I joined late. Had a long weekend, and could not join in on time. But I mean, whatever I've heard or whatever I've followed till now, I think I agree with most people. I think whatever the points that Samir and Surya made, um, it's absolutely spot on. And even what was Saurabh was saying, that I think for future reference, or for future, the trajectory of Russia and China relationship is, I think, has to be our main focus, right? Um, it cannot be, even our discourse cannot be just a binary of trying to hedge and balance against the West and the rest, or the West and the East, right? We have to be more aware, and more perceptive towards the shifts happening near us, right? And I do not for one think that this whole, I mean, if there is no doubt that Russia and China are closer and will have more incentives to be closer than it had before, right? But if you are working from an assumption, see, as an individual you can work from the assumption that, oh, this dragon bear is happening, right? But as a country, it's not in your interest, or it is, the onus is on you, right, to not treat it as a foregone conclusion, so to speak, right? If you have, for example, if it's in your interest that the two countries, even though they might be automatically getting together, right? I mean, think from the Chinese perspective, they know that ultimately India and the West are aligning more closely. The pace, of course, may differ, right? It may go up, it may go down, but that broader alignment is happening, right? So the Chinese, from the Chinese perspective, or from the Russian perspective, they do whatever they can to ensure that from time to time they come and they kind of pat you in the back and say, hey, listen, what are you doing, right? And kind of give you a kind of a nod, or so to speak, to basically letting you know that, I mean, that can be through overtly kind of threat, etc., or it could be through luring of, so to say, this grand bargain or something like a reset or whatever, right? So I'm giving you some incentive, so to speak. Now, this is, I think, I mean, of course there are differences, but the basic point remains that India does not and cannot afford to have a Russia, China, Pakistan axis. That will be devastating, right? I mean, I would just like to think, and I've been thinking about this for like at least last 1 week or so. I mean, if you are indeed saying that the Russia China de facto military alliance, so to speak, will become like I mean, it's going to get stronger, right? And of course, Pakistan being in the China's axis as it is right now, right? If you are saying that this is the reality, or this is something which is going to happen in future for sure, right? Then kind of picture, or paint a picture for for yourself and others, that if Russia, China, Pakistan, axis does come to fruition, what kind of an Asia do you think it will be for India? And how much do you think the US or any other country will be able to help you? And in what ways, right? To feel secure in Asia, in not, I mean, especially in the subcontinent, right? I mean, combine Russia's diplomatic power, which, by the way, is going to stay no matter how much people in the West talk about. So combine Russia's diplomatic power, its residual military power, right? It's still going to be a very powerful country militarily. China's economic, diplomatic power, so to speak, and Pakistan undying devotion to hurt India, right? I mean, it can be a very, I mean, it does sound like, a threat that we should be, aware of, or be careful of, right? So my only concern is this, that I don't think that, if we take all our actions from this assumption that, the Russia, China, Pakistan, that battle is lost, so to speak, right? And we don't do anything, or we don't even try, so to speak, then I think we are going to look at Asia in a very myopic way. Also, I think we also have to look at globalization. I saw a TED talk by Shiv Shankar Menon, very interesting. This was, I think, he just shared recently, and I think a lot of people are also now considering the fact that a lot of their assumptions about the future of all these kind of alignments, realignments, and even relationships are based on the fact that globalization is, not going anywhere. I'm not so sure, right? And so are, I mean, a lot of other people. I mean, again, this is not to say, it's not to announce the demise of the globalized world, but there is a certain pullback, and there will be challenges that will come with it, right? So I think in that ways, we have to kind of recalibrate our thinking to even include these ideas. There has to be greater attention, as I said, paid to what Russia and China are actually doing rather than what people think they're doing. See, let's be honest, in our discourse, how many of us actually follow a Russian expert who resides in Russia, who looks and reads and talks, you know, uh, 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 about Russia and what the Russian people are thinking or what the Russian elites are thinking? So I think, and same goes with the Chinese to some extent. Of course, there are some experts who do that, but in our general mainstream discourse, there you find none, right? So again, I think it is in our interest to make sure that we understand these issues from a very independent basis, right? Take a very kind of headstrong or like an independent view, because this is very important, right? This is not just about West and the rest. And I understand that our social media interaction, including myself, sometimes we're fixated on that because it, precisely because we have the Western commentators or the Western press or the Western diplomats, all the discussion and debates surrounds them, because that's who we have to interact with. We're not interacting with the Russians. We're not interacting with the Russian media. I mean, technically sometimes we can't even do that now because there is censorship and whatnot, but that you get my point, right? So that is one. I think the Russian, this whole dragon bear thing, yes, it is happening, but what are we going to do about it? What are our options, so to speak, right? So that's one. And just to finish, I think something which Surya was also pointing at, um, a lot of times when people talk about public opinion, right? Public opinion as not being a factor in these relationships, and saying that the US will, or the US government and the Indian government will kind of ignore these general trends and carry on with what they are doing. And and I agree with them, right? That public opinion does not have that much of an impact, especially in India, because we don't have levers or kind of platforms through which these can be articulated. There are no pressure groups, so to speak. I mean, there are, but again, these are not that consequential. But in America, that can be the case. But overall, even though I understand that, I think, yes, in the long run, the adults who are in charge, so to speak, will take care and will have these dialogues in a very mature fashion, maybe even privately. But I will say that public opinion does matter, right? You can make and you can keep on these, you can make this argument that no, this is not coming from American official channel, this is just Western media, the Western press, etc. But that's not the point. It's not like that continuous coverage or framing of issues such as that, if it has an impact in the long term, 2 years, 3 years from now, let's say, again, as Saurabh rightly pointed out, this is not going away. The sanctions are not going to be, all sanctions not going to be taken off. There's not going to be a U-turn on Russia, so to speak. At least it will take years, right? So that normalization will not happen, and China and India will find. Trust me. I mean, even though we've been talking about how the Indians have subbed the Chinese, etc., etc., which is great from an Indian perspective, but ultimately we will find common ground on Russia a lot of times, and I think that will be portrayed in a fashion um, which I don't think a lot of Indians would like, even in the Indian ruling elite, so to speak, or the diplomatic commentariat. Right? I just saw a tweet by Ambassador Rao, right? Nirupama. She pointed out that this is also becoming, this hectoring from the West is also becoming a little kind of tedious, so to speak, right? And even I think Professor Happymon Jacob, he also, I remember him saying this, that our strategic autonomy, yes, we are is constrained and limited by Russian dependency or our dependency on Russian weapons, but in the future there may be a point that uh, if a partner or an ally or any actor is kind of restricting your choices through whatever means, right? Then again, that is also a restriction or limitation of your strategic autonomy to some extent, right? So I think public opinion, yes, it does not matter now, especially in the short term, right? Things will cool down and so will the media, etc. But again, remember, and again, I keep saying this, remember the Indian media's coverage in the Nepal earthquake crisis, so to speak, and how after that the opinion against India has just gone from bad to worse, right? And that has become a challenge, by the way, in for India in Nepal's political circles, right? Ashley Tellis, remember, was talking about disenchantment in at the Capitol Hill, or at the executive branch or the legislative branch when it comes to India, right? Again, I would like to just remind American counterparts or American friends that that disenchantment can happen two ways, right? It's a two-way street, right? It can happen. I mean, I'm not saying it. I'm not saying it as a threat or something. Somebody who, who, I'm not saying it like, kind of right back at you kind of thing. I'm basically saying that, it can happen on both sides, and and most of us know that there are elements both on the right and the left in India who would like nothing more than to sabotage the American Indo-American relationship, right? And there are people in both sides, so to speak. So I think we have to be careful on that. We have to emphasize and we have to articulate our interests and our positions very well, which I think the government is doing. And yeah, ensure that we also articulate as to what is our future action and what are our main goals. I think then probably a lot of people who have been misguided from the fact that, see, a lot of times when when Wangi's visit happened yesterday, I think a lot of people were very genuinely wanting that there has to be some sort of a, if not a reset, but a rapprochement, so to speak, so that there is dialing down of tension, which is a good thing. But again, I would say that it's something which India alone cannot do. It's a very difficult thing to do, right? I mean, if you're having an honest conversation on de-escalation, etc., there will be pressures from the public as to what is the technicality, what are you actually conceding, what you're not conceding. So exactly, public opinion matters. The government cannot be seen as to conceding anything, even patrolling rights in some friction points, right? Especially after what has been happening. So public opinion in that sense, whether it is the China relationship, whether it is the Russian relationship, or less so in the Russians case, but all these things matter in the long run. And uh, in that sense, we have to be willing to make that case in a very much more clear manner, but also study other changes more carefully than we have, like especially the Russia China alignment, so to speak, and the possibility of what that would do to a Pakistan, right? And what I mean, they also feel, I would say they are also feeling a little giddy at that prospect, because they know that the US relationship is lost. I think that is why you see Prime Minister Imran Khan or anybody else, if he's gone today or tomorrow, that it's gone. It's not something it's in our interest. Yes, you can try to balance it out, but it's something which is to some extent, beyond salvaging. So they are very much dependent on China. Of course, maybe Russia will be too in some economic or financial ways. But let's be honest, right? In the demise, I think there are people in India and elsewhere are too premature to talk about the demise of Russia. They are not going anywhere. Even if, okay, let's say there is a regime change, do you think a Western kind of a backed or a pro-Western candidate will survive in Russia? They will not, right? Maybe there will be somebody else who's more balanced, etc. But let's not look at those kind of fantasies or etc. But ultimately focus on, yes, Russia is weakened, etc., and Russia will be weakened further, to my opinion as well. But it can be entirely possible. You're seeing that they are also dialing down their rhetoric, preparing their public for also a kind of a withdrawal, a kind of like a like, so to speak, giving themselves an off ramp. And I think even the Western countries should realize that, listen, this is also a time where they also need to take a step back and make sure, or give Putin kind of an off ramp, so to speak, because I think in the end it will save the Ukrainian people. They've fought well, and yes, there will be problems. Yes, there will be tough conversations to had when it comes to what to do with the eastern Ukraine, for example. But I think we can all agree that that will be the best. I mean, that can be something that can be solved through dialogue. Maybe the West can offer to relieve some pressure, etc., etc. But That's the basic point here. And for Indian perspective, let's look at the Russian relationship with China more closely than we have been doing, because I think that is the crux of our, thinking, and that will be key for us to understand as to what and how much should we hedge and balance against, these two poles that are emerging today. So that's it. I'm sorry. I would have loved to hear other arguments that were made, etc., on the panel, but yeah, maybe next time. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add on that, since you made some very interesting points, and then we are done because I just have some, because you raised about information warfare and the way it affects governance and domestic political consensus, as we know. So I think I remember Shiv Shankar Menon coming on off the cuff, and he discussed a long time back that it's happening in the developed countries. Now, of course, he added India in that, but I don't think that's happening in India in that particular sense still, because India's political discourse is very, very different. It's not so quote unquote monolithic or very, very obvious as everybody thinks. It's very diverse. So not getting on India, but I think with the developed countries, first of all, I think it's a case that definitely the US is trying to consolidate its relationship with Europe, but there is a primal, not a primal, but at least a secondary sense of multipolarity, which is reflective even in the discourse and the policy measures that Europe wants to do, right? So I think we know that information warfare does affect public opinion. For example, it might not affect the governments in that sense largely, but it might affect the stakeholders who will become the stakeholders of the government within the government, or those who will become the quote unquote stakeholders. And I think it has to do with the genealogy of what
Yeah, I mean,
what
just to add a small point here. Remember, a lot of
yeah,
Western commentators keep saying that it is the nostalgia which is holding the Indians back, the Indian
yeah,
elites, the Indian people, right? So you're conceding the argument, right? In that sense, of course, when it's
yeah,
convenient to you to explain India's decision, that
yeah.
yes, the sense of nostalgia and some public opinion is
Mhm.
contributing to India's position to kind of hedge and not totally go against Russia, so to speak. Of course, we know that's not the case. There are multiple
Yeah,
complex reasons. But you concede
yeah,
the point yourself, right? So when you are
yeah,
conceding that this can be a factor in this sense, then why can't it be factor the other way around when it comes to, US in the Indian US relationship in the long term, right? So that's my only
yeah.
point. I'm not saying it's going to be fatal or it's going to be,
We can't know.
very problematic,
Yeah.
but it will increase challenges, right? They
Yes.
will increase their rhetoric. You will have in your domestic arena. See, remember, even this government or any other government, they're not going to
Mhm.
be this popular or strong forever. You may see the next government, so to speak, in India not being, a majority. Maybe it's a coalition government. Then you will have
We never know.
pressures.
Yeah.
Yeah, then you'll have pressures from different players within that coalition, right? That
Mm-hmm.
why you're listening and why you're doing this, etc., etc. And then that, my point is that once foreign policy issues become a part of your domestic issue and rhetoric, then you have incentives to kind of always harangue or go against a certain country. Saudi Arabia is one country or one relationship which has entered Saudi sorry the US domestic politics in some way, where you see that
Mm-hmm.
there is an effect of US public opinion having a large impact on the relationship or the trajectory of that relationship, right? The
Yeah.
Saudis again, and that is has led to some problems between them, right? So I think we have to look at it from that angle and just not dismiss it right away. That's all I'm saying, right? No, everything will be fine, etc. Let's not be that
Yeah.
overtly confident as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And to just conclude fast, I think what happens is that when the domestic populace and the stakeholders and the government, all these three constituents of the state in that particular sense to understand foreign policy, engage and understand what's happening, I think it's a lot about information overload and also disinformation overload. But I think for that we need a separate discussion on information warfare, because to be very fair on information warfare, I have been criticizing also, but I think that information warfare is just too far-fetched sometimes, or also sometimes too fetched. But anyways, it's a thing altogether. And this is also why, despite being with the thing that, you know what, we need to be careful, I think that there are a lot of positive things going to happen in the Indo-American relations paradigm. And it's very obvious, it happened with the Soviets also in some ways, dark or good or somewhere. So we can say in the wild west way, good, bad, and ugly with India and US, but I think it's going to be fine. for now, at least for this decade, in my view. So we conclude this discussion. I thank Surya, Samir, Akshob, Saurabh, and the special cameo of Rishabh for this episode of Global Hint. And we are already on Spotify, Anchor, Google Podcasts, and other platforms. We will be posting nearly all of our Indus Thing, Global Hint, AI Now, and Indian Integrals episode from season 1 very soon. And once the same happens, we'll declare immediately. Till then, thank you so much. It was a nice discussion with all of you. And yes, we'll see all of you next time. Thank you.
Bye bye.